everyone. If you'd like to take a seat. We're going to begin our panel on youth perspectives on criminal justice reform. My name is Luna Miller. I am an assistant director here at IYC, and I'm going to be moderating today's panel. Very quickly, if all of our esteemed guests would like to give a quick introduction and their name.
Hello, is it working? Okay, yeah, okay. Hi, my name is Samantha Rae, and I am a master's student here at UCLA for the Social Welfare Department.
Hi, I'm James DeBacco. I'm a MSW graduate this year, and I'm with the IYC team.
So I'm Robert Hernandez. I'm faculty at the USC Suzanne Dork-Peck School of Social Work, and I'm also the founder and board chair of Visionary Youth Los Angeles.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Hope all is well. My name is Dr. David Turner III. I am a faculty member here in our Department of Social Welfare. I'm also the incoming faculty director for the $1 Million Hoods Project, which is a project to map the fiscal and human costs of incarceration here in Los Angeles County and beyond. I wear a lot of other hats, right? Not just this one. But have been working in youth justice and youth organizing for the last decade or so. So really excited to be here today.
Fantastic, guys. Thank you so much. If each of you would like to give a brief overview or of any statements that you prepared regarding this topic, just exploring innovative approaches and the impact of youth advocacy and transforming justice, we can just go ahead and go down the line again.
Yes, thank you, Luna. So I want to start with, although I am young, I have had the privilege to work in many reentry and diversion settings now, where my clients were justice impacted, such as at community mental health clinics, in residential settings like independent living homes, and at school districts and schools specifically designed for justice impacted youth to reduce recidivism rates, which is the likelihood of formerly incarcerated persons to reoffend. In America, the likelihood of a youth being rearrested following their release from incarceration after 1 year is 55%. In California, this number increases to 74.2% after 3 years. Youth have also been more likely than adult offenders to return to in prison. Globally, the United Nations Children's Fund has estimated that more than 1 million youth are behind bars today. We might imagine that this number has increased with contemporary global events such as the current movements for liberation in Palestine, Congo, Sudan, Haiti, Myanmar, and many others. So why am I giving all these statistics and numbers? Well, the point is to tell you that as we sit here right now, many youth around the world are incarcerated, and that those youth have a disproportionately higher chance of being re-incarcerated following their release. It is also to say that this issue affects youth in a unique way as opposed to their adult counterparts, especially low income and youth of color who disproportionately show up within these systems. It is also to say that it is clear that whatever we are doing right now is not working. The current system, the carceral system that enforces surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems is not working, and has really only produced harm from what we just heard. I believe it is possible to build a society where we can address harm without relying on structural forms of oppression, like the very violent systems that continue to reproduce these tropes. We know that prisons, policing, and incarceration does little to reduce crime rates, especially for youth. And we also know that these systems do little to actually change the culture that produces crime, aims to hold perpetrators accountable without actually producing accountability or restorative effects, and does not meet the needs of victims of crimes either. Moreover, we know that carceral expansion, or putting more resources into the carceral prison system, is not associated with reducing crime rates. It also tends to result in the divestment of resources from community-based resources and programs that aim to reduce crime through prevention and promotion efforts, like social service programs. And that the expansion of the system ultimately only really targets BIPOC communities, trans and gender nonconforming people, young people from low-income backgrounds, people with mental health-related issues, and otherwise marginalized individuals. The answer, I believe, is really to dismantle systems that uphold these carceral ideologies and implement more restorative justice initiatives. To emphasize, the answer is not inflicting more violence and trauma through punitive measures like carceral systems across the world. It is building communities of people who support one another to follow paths that positively shape community, a community that will ultimately shape at large our global community.
Thank you, Sam. I didn't prepare a statement today because I really wanted to become organic with the room today and just share a little bit about what it's like to be system impacted, what it's like to be justice impacted, and live a life of privilege in reference to being white, in reference to having abilities to do things that others might not have been able to do because of socioeconomic status or other reasons growing up. But at the same time, also identify that our system's broken and our system continues to show fail in many areas. So let me just give you a background of who I am. When I was born, I was taken from my parents from birth. As a result of being taken from my parents from birth, I was placed into state care. So by the time I was 13 years old, I had lived in orphanages, I had lived in placement homes, and I had been abused emotionally, psychologically, physically, sexually, and I was traumatized beyond no belief. It's because of those periods and those circumstances that I went through as a young boy that I didn't really understand. I didn't really know how to identify with what was going on with me, that I started going down a path of wrong behavior. What I mean by wrong behavior, I was stealing by the time I was 5 from stores, candy bars here and there. You know, I was just trying to fit in with kids in the orphanage. My brother was 2 years older than me, and we shared a same space in bunk beds. And the ironic thing is that while he was 2 years older than me, he also had his life that he was trying to cultivate and protect from. Growing up in the horrors of the DCFS system, that's the Department of Children and Family Services, back in the 70s was real. There was no hopes. There was no lifelines. Social workers weren't standing in line and readily available to help you. It's a whole different time back then. So it became a period of survival for me. I come from a product of watching my foster mother take her own life. That's after she had murdered my foster sister and foster father at 5. She pointed the gun at me. My brother had stepped in front of me. She pulled the trigger and then laughed when the gun didn't go off. It was a revolver. When she laughed, she took a drink from the bottle that she had in her hand. It looked like she was smiling at me when she put the gun in her mouth and shot herself right in front of me. I was 5. You know, and these are moments that I will never forget for the rest of my life. And maybe these were the moments that begin to shape how my life would evolve and mature into the man I've become today. But there's more. growing up in the foster care system, I didn't trust anybody. And when I mean by anybody, I mean anybody. I was given an opportunity to be adopted at 13 years of age. But the rule was, if you didn't want to take our name, then we would send you back. So obviously I took the path of adoption. But just because you're adopted doesn't mean it makes it any easier. And here's the interesting thing about this. When I was adopted, my brother had already been taken from me. For some of you who might remember this, there was a time when Dodger Stadium used to do Adopt a Child Night. And at that point, prospect parents would come and inspect children who are lined up on third baseline and first baseline to see whether or not if you would be able to be a good fit for the family. Well, my brother was picked. I wasn't. So within 72 hours, he was transferred somewhere else. And I was just left watching him being driven away in the Chevy four-door brown car that he was in, waving goodbye. It's moments like that that you never forget. It's moments like that that really remind you in later years just what life is really all about. Meaning and purpose. But those weren't things that were synonymous with me growing up. Eventually, my brother and I, we were connected after about 6 years. My parents were allowed to let me see him. So on his birthday, I went to go see him. I visited him for a weekend. And then it became my birthday 3 months later. And I was able to visit him one more time. Less than a month later, he was killed by a drunk driver. And my whole world shattered. Here I am trying to fight, survive, live a life that's not even my own. Because every day when you're trying to survive the horrors of living somebody else's life, you're trying to be invisible. You don't want anybody to know you. You're just trying to make it through the next day. I remember the times when I was tied to the bed with an ace bandage and then sodomized by my stepfather. And if I cried, then Palmolive dishwasher soap would be squirted in my mouth. And I would be locked in a closet for days. And maybe it's because of these times that when I did decide to enlist in the United States Marine Corps, that I thought I could run away from all my problems. But the Marines just made me worse. They taught me how to become more violent and survive by living with violence. Well, eventually I was kicked out of the Marine Corps for being too violent. And I ended up on the street. I was homeless. And if you all know where Torrance is, I lived in a Salvation Army box behind the Lama Mall. That's where I stayed at nighttime. If I couldn't find anywhere to lay my head down for the night, and then I became a criminal for survival. I started out with small things, stealing here and there. Then I got into forgeries. One thing led to another. Started working odd jobs. Got involved with drugs. And then my life just kept spiraling out of control. Until one day where I made a poor choice, bad decision that landed me in prison for 28 years. While I was on the inside, I became an associate member with the Aryan Brotherhood prison gang. And I played that part. I lived that part. because that's what was necessary for me for survival. And I tell you this today because there are so many youth out there that have no hope. They have no way of identifying their self-worth. And why is that? Have we just totally forgotten youth? That's what it seems. When we look into the communities, when we look in these cities, what has happened to our youth? It just seems like the city has eroded and the youth have fallen with the erosion. It takes a lot to be a youth nowadays. With technology, with the absent families, COVID didn't help. But you know what? I'm here to inspire, not to hinder. I eventually got out of prison, earned my associate's degree, Human Services Addiction Studies, then went to California State University, Los Angeles, earned my Bachelor's of Science in Rehabilitation Services, was the president of the Rehabilitation Counseling Association at California State University, Los Angeles. And I just graduated from USC with my Master's of Social Work 2.5 weeks ago. Thank you. It's been a journey. It's been hard. It hasn't been easy. But you know what? Every time I think about why am I sitting here? It's because of you. You, the youth, are the ones that inspire me. Ironically, I work with a nonprofit organization on the street. I'm a program manager for men and women who are returning back to society. And I help them reintegrate back into society one moment at a time. And I think to myself, if we can do this with adults, then why do we have such a hard time doing this with our youth? And so I challenge each and every one of you here today. What part do you play in your life that not only provides hope and dreams, ambition, and goals for you, but for the people around you? Youth is the future. You are the future. Wow.
Thank you, James. Much appreciated. And I'm just so honored to say that I've been had the good fortune of getting to know James for the last couple of years, and it's so great to see where he's at today. And you know, the sad reality is that, and when I say this, there's so many out there, right? And so many who haven't been able to go through certain vehicles. And when it's all said and done, it's not rocket science. It's about access and opportunity for empowerment to happen. That's what needs to take place. I thank people like my sister, Shalon Joseph over there with District Attorney George Gascon's office, who's been a champion at this with me for years. David Corral, who's leading a big task, right? Big task. And our OICR brothers and brethren, and just all of you for being here, just being open to this, our VYLA people and USC. But I share that because, you know, whenever I qualify or quantify myself or just qualify myself, I always say I'm 100% Alayan, 100% Alayan. People look at me, what do you mean? Born, raised, bred, generation upon that generation upon that generation and upon that generation right here, homegrown in LA. And I say that because we're a rare breed. So when people say go back to where you came from, I'm like, where do you want me to go? I mean, this is like, actually, you're in my country, you know. Technically, it is Mexico, but that's a whole other lecture, right? So, you know, I'm honored even to be here at UCLA with Dr. right here. I've had to hear him speak at the Holly Mitchell, which was event. And it's just exciting because we do have an opportunity. We have an opportunity. We just can't miss it. We can't miss it. And that window is so thin because, as you mentioned, we saw where our youth were headed pre-COVID. That just exacerbated it, right? I mean, big time, big time. Being raised here in LA, and a lot of my studies and my doctoral studies was in this global epidemic that we were seeing, what they're referring to as turbo development, rapid development. Here domestically, we see it as gentrification. And we see how that's actually really creating the psychological barriers for our communities. It's interesting. I drive through the city. This is home. I see people who were there, born and raised here, no longer living there, right? I drive through other areas of the city and I see blasted with graffiti, tagging. But it's interesting. It's not so much banging. It's more of like, we're still here. We're still trying to hold on to our homeland, right? It's nothing new. It's a form of colonization. And we're seeing this. And it's interesting because a lot of neighborhoods actually protect their people. They actually attempt to protect the resources we have. But it's interesting when you have colonization, you have rapid development, you have gentrification, it's then policed and it becomes violent and it becomes conflict. And it's interesting because colonization is violent. And we're seeing that globally. I mean, studies indicate by 2050, 70% of the world will be gentrified. And it's also saying those that will see an uptick in violence, we're seeing it right now, globally, but largely Africa, China, South America, and then here in the States, when people are like, wow, what's happening? What's taking place? It's essentially conflict over resources over land, over space. It's interesting. I go to certain conferences, I go to certain things, and I'm hearing what I've heard throughout the years about we got to reform this, we got to do this. But when do we start to identify the root causes, the drivers of this? An economic system that does not favor people of color. Just being real. End of the day. And I would say it's operating the way it needs to operate, but you're seeing the strain directly. And with that becomes psychological barriers. And who's most directly affected? Our youth. Our youth. Because they're being re-traumatized. They're acting out that trauma. And they're being met with what? A hammer. Discriminatory policies that continue to re-traumatize them. And I say we're in a moment, a window, because we're in another political landscape. You're seeing it. Honestly, we're just getting out of the discriminatory legislation or fear-based legislation of the 90s, which a lot of our brethren and sisters got caught up in. But we're right here where we're already hearing people talk that rhetoric again. So this is the opportunity. This is the moment. And my whole commitment has been looking at community trauma, how it impacts healthy youth development, but also getting in front of youth before any system contact. I'm talking child welfare, school social work. I always call it out. We could throw mud at law enforcement all we can, but we have done a dishonor to communities of color. We have broken up families left and right. Child welfare has, right? We just heard a story. And until we own it, we take accountability for it, how are we going to advance? And I share this with a lot of my indigenous brothers and sisters and elders. I don't think, when will America have its own therapy session? And that's in alignment with trauma informed. You got to acknowledge the wound before you could actually start to heal. So we haven't even acknowledged what we've done and the genocide we've caused here, and we're continuing to cause. And how do we start to bring up and about solutions that really start to hit some of these drivers? So I share that with you. I'm thankful to be here, thankful to be on this panel, and I appreciate all of you taking time out of your busy schedules to just share space with each other, communicate, connect, and thank you so much.
All right. What's going on, people? So I think first and foremost, right, I want to start off by letting y'all know a little bit about who I am, right? So first, I'm something called an abolitionist, right? By being an abolitionist, I believe that we need to build a world that is not predicated on using violence as a means to achieve accountability, right? In addition to that, I believe that we need to be able to build a world that has multiple responses to organized violence and something called organized abandonment. For those of you who don't know what organized abandonment is, it is this notion or this idea or this concentrated effort or efforts, right, that take resources away from entire communities and replaces those resources with policing and prison, right? So I'm the only child or the only person in my immediate family who has not been incarcerated, right? And because of that, I've seen the ways how the carceral state more broadly, policing specifically, right, has harmed communities. And what I know to be true is that policing as it currently exists today, the carceral state as it currently exists today, and more broadly, punishment as it currently exists today does not equal justice, and it can never equal justice, right? I think across multiple systems that are facilitated by the state, and when I say the state, I'm talking about Department of Child and Family Services, I'm talking about policing, I'm talking about our use of the courts and all these other things, right? When we use these particular systems to achieve justice, it does not keep communities safer, right? As we heard from James's story, right, being broken up from his family didn't keep him safer, right? As we have heard in all of these other places, and as we saw here on our own campus, when law enforcement officers stood by as peaceful students were protesting, right, and using their right to protest, right, law enforcement did not keep those students safer. In fact, the very next day after being violently attacked, those students were then attacked by law enforcement themselves, 7 different agencies coordinated by an outside intelligence officer to do that, right? And again, I'm saying this, right, because I think we need to abandon this idea that policing is what is going to be the tool to keep us safe. It's not. And not only is that not going to be the tool that keeps us safe, it is quite frankly what is siphoning the rest of the resources that we can use to build these life-sustaining systems that we know are actually effective in keeping young people and keeping communities whole. To give you a brief example of what this looks like here in the city of Los Angeles, right? In the city of Los Angeles, we spend over $50 million on animal control. We spend over $50 million on animal control, and we spend less than $45 million on workforce development. So you mean to tell me that us catching dogs is more important than people getting jobs? Somebody explain that. In the city of Los Angeles, the city, not the county, in the city of Los Angeles, right? The Office for Youth Development receives about $8 to $10 million a year. The LAPD budgets $25 million a year for their lawsuits alone, for when they get sued, right? So why is it that we can put more money in preparing to pay for when law enforcement messes up than we do in supporting our young people? Right? So I say this to say, right, that in order for us to build the kind of futures we want to see, we have to make different budgetary choices. We have to make different political choices. These are political choices that are rooted in keeping communities safe, that are rooted in keeping people safe, and rooted in ensuring that young folks like James never make it to the carceral state in the first place. That's the work that people like David Carroll are doing in the Department of Youth Development. That's the work that community organizations like the Social Justice Learning Institute, Brotherhood Crusade, the Youth Justice Coalition, all these other spaces, that's what they're doing in Los Angeles right now. To close, I want to share a quick story with you. There was a court, Kenyan Juvenile Court, that was on 76th Place and Central, and deep in South Central Los Angeles, that was responsible for incarcerating children. In 2013, because of the advocacy and the organizing of folks like the Youth Justice Coalition and other community organizations, right, that court closed. In 2019, that building was repurposed to become Free LA High School, to become the True Coast Justice Center, and to house not only the Youth Justice Coalition, but also gang intervention efforts, also an entire school, and to become a community space, right, that has now been used to transform what it is we think about youth justice. So again, I mention all of this to say that when we talk about transforming our youth justice system and we're talking about abolition, right, a lot of people think that just means we want to burn all prisons and get rid of all the cops. And that's cool and all. But what's more important is building the infrastructure, the resources and tools necessary to sustain life. And if we aren't invested in doing that, then why are we talking about young people? That's it.
Thank you to all our speakers. Those were wonderful presentations. Dr. Turner, I'd like to direct a question to you and the rest of our panel as well. More specifically, what is the history of youth justice in Los Angeles? You all have experiences here in LA in one way or another with this system, or concrete examples of victories that you can think of in the youth justice circles. We'll start with Dr. Turner and make our way back. That way we can equalize our panel a little bit.
All right. And my apologies. I'm going to have to step out after this. I have a student who is proposing her dissertation proposal today. So we are going to make sure that she gets closer to graduation. Right. But I think as we're talking about the history of youth justice here in Los Angeles, right, what is important to remember is that LA and California more broadly were the initial laboratories in experimenting around youth criminalization, right? So, I mean, from the early times when we're talking about the colonial periods and thinking about how LA was going to continue to build its jail infrastructure, targeting Native communities and preventing Native communities from organizing against the colonial powers, right, all the way through to the criminalization of the Chicano movement, of the Black Power movement, right, and in particular, right, these movements are being driven by young people, right, like, and then from there, right, to the criminalization and war on gangs, right? And how that war on gangs sort of led to this development of super predator logic that became the undergirding ideology and philosophy behind what we know now today as mass incarceration, right? A lot of that started and was piloted here in California, right? Here in California and Los Angeles specifically. So it's important for us to remember that the youth justice apparatus, right, that led to the growth of our large probation department, that led to the growth of all of these different juvenile facilities, right, that brought police officers to school campuses, right, started and was incubated here in Los Angeles. Now, I don't want to mention that and just say, well, yeah, we've been dealing with all this carceral repression and thinking that people just accepted it, because at no point in time did our communities just blindly accept that as truth, right? Communities have been organizing and working to transform these conditions. And not only have they been organizing, they have been winning. So what does this winning look like? How do we understand or assess these wins when we're talking about youth justice? Well, first and foremost, starting from the top of the 2010s to now, right, youth arrests have gone down nearly 80%, right? To where at one point we were arresting over 12,000 young people a year, right, and incarcerating as many, right? And now there are less than 500 young people incarcerated in LA County today. Right? And that is because of the advocacy and organizing around diversion work, of the advocacy and organizing around getting young people access to different resources and ensuring that young people don't go down those routes in the first place. Right? First and foremost. Second, right, in LA County, right there, at one point in time, there were 16 different facilities that were used to incarcerate and engage young people. Right now, there are 6. And closing these facilities that were used to incarcerate young people, that were used to as apparatuses of control, is directly connected to the ongoing organizing of folks like the LA Youth Uprising Coalition, right? Of folks like the Arts for Healing Justice Network, which formerly was the Arts for Incarcerated Youth Network, right? You know, for folks like the Anti-Recidivism Coalition and others who have been involved, right, in this organizing to transform these systems. Right. And not only did we experience that on the youth justice front, but we also experienced it in the school front. As we also know, right, that criminalization happens intimately in our schools. At one point, right, it was totally cool for a cop and a dog to just walk in a classroom and randomly search people. Community stopped that by ending random searches in LAUSD. At one point, the LAUSD school police had tanks, had M16 assault rifles, and had rocket launchers by being able to apply for Obama's 1033 military surplus program. Imagine school police with rocket launchers. Wow, right? Folks are like, wait, why would school cops need that type of artillery? That is a great question. Now, the challenge, not the challenge of that, but the transformation for that is organizations like the Labor Community Strategy Center led a campaign, right, for the LAUSD to liquidate those weapons and to liquidate all of that stuff, and also to issue a public apology for it. I was a part of a campaign where we defunded school police by 35% and then used that money, which was about $25 million, to start a Black Student Achievement Plan. Let me repeat that. We took cop money and gave it to Black people. Right? And that Black Student Achievement Plan has been used to hire more social workers, has been used to hire school climate coaches, has been used, right, to work to transform what our schools look like. Here in LAUSD, led by organizations like Students Deserve, Community Coalition, Inner City Struggle, Labor Community Strategy Center, Brother Son Selves Coalition, the United Teachers Los Angeles. We got the teachers union involved in this. Again, right? Communities working to build power to transform the carceral state is critical and is vital, right? And if we really want to work with those who are interested in abolition, we got to work with the people who are working to make it happen, the people who are building the power to make it happen. So as we're talking about youth justice, as we're talking about youth criminalization, it is important to remember, right, that at no point in time in our history did people just take this on the chin. People were fighting back, and people are currently fighting back to make the dream of abolition a reality. And with that, I do have to go. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you very much. If any of our other panelists would like to comment on this or comment about just youth reform in LA, please feel free to do so. If not, I have other follow-up questions.
I just want to thank Dr. Turner again for the good background. Yeah, historically, people think of California being this progressive state, but we are responsible for incarcerating our youth. Think about it, 1984 to recent, we built over 40 prisons in the state of California. We're responsible for the gang injunctions, the gang database, um, Proposition 21, trying youth as adults, the STEP Act of 1984, Street Terrorism Enforcement Prevention Act, which actually codified and labeled somebody a gang member, right? So think about it. You have a kid who's been traumatized, acting out that trauma at the age of 11, 12. You label them a gang member. Do you still see them as a child? You see them as a menace to society, right? That started all here in California. California. This ain't Texas, ain't Alabama, California. So, but there has been some good advocacy, definitely throughout the years, really challenging. We have a moratorium on the gang database. It's not used anymore, right? Here in California, specifically LA. So there's so many advances that are happening, and it hasn't just happened just overnight. It's been years and years and years. I think of Champions in Service. I think of PCI-TI. I think of Homeo Needles. I think of individuals that have lived experience, but also have what they call a license to operate. And that's so much different because we're hearing a lot about credible messengers, which is great, lived experience, but we're talking about people who actually can engage with the violence to stop the violence, engage with those who promote violence within their community to actually bring to the table, to bring treatment and access to care. So important, so important. So now we even have and are recognizing community intervention workers as part of a public safety strategy and plan. That's huge. That's huge for the city and county of LA, where you have community violence interventionists who come from the sordid past, live the lifestyle, who are now being recognized for their worth and how they need to be a part and included in this. So there has been advances by so many, so many. And it's good to see where we're at, but we can't let off the gas because right now we got to continue to push forward. But again, LA is responsible for so many of the heinous, outrageous, punitive measures ever imagined placed on our youth. But now, as we're attempting to hopefully move away from that, we could hopefully influence other states and jurisdictions to follow suit.
You know, I come from a different perspective, obviously. I do know that, you know, some of the success with youth development, particularly with gangs and reorganizing the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitations with YOP programs, youth offender programming. You know, I was happy to be a part of the initial development and building of the YOP curriculum within the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. When I came into prison, the Department of Corrections would actually have youth of ages from 14 to 17 in prison, in adult prison. And you ask yourself, how does somebody who comes in at such a young age in an adult correctional environment, how do they survive? I was 22 years old and I had a hell of a time. And I gravitated to the gangs for survival. And I'm coming out of the Marine Corps. Now, what about the youth that don't have that type of combat training, that don't have those skill sets to be able to survive in certain circumstances? And they're still growing. Their mind is still growing. So even within the California Department of Corrections, 25 and under is considered youth. That's the terms. And so what they've done is they've created a system now where they're not allowing youth under the age of 18 to be admitted into the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. So much trauma happens in an adult correctional institution when our cities and our counties compel and force youth, children, into adult settings where it's the wild, wild west. It's unstable. Nothing is secure. And it's scary. I remember being a teen going to McLaren Hall for truancy. I got caught outside of my school and I got picked up by the police and taken to McLaren Hall. Do any of you know what McLaren Hall is? McLaren Hall was kind of like the juvenile jail. Well, I went to one in Baldwin Park, you know, and you would be picked up for anything. If you were hanging around at a market and you were supposed to be in school, you're going to McLaren Hall. And your parents would get a call. And sometimes your parents would just leave you there until they felt like you were ready to come home. Now imagine that. Imagine going out to the market with your friends or going to the mall with your friends. Just say you have a ditch day as you're a youth and you get picked up and thrown in jail simply because you're supposed to be at school. But while you're in this juvenile jail, now you get assaulted. Maybe you get raped, sexually assaulted. How do you recover from that? How do you bounce back from something so horrific and so traumatic? You know, so we have a lot of work to do. What we're talking about up here are the things that are visible. But what's missing in all of this are the things that are unseen, are the things that are invisible. Taking money and putting it to carceral systems to create more funding so that law enforcement officers and correctional officers are able to make more money because it's such a hard job to babysit. And we take it away from the actual development for youth. That's a problem. You know, one of the cool things I've had the opportunity to experience being out here, because I've been on parole for 5 years. I'm still not free. I'm waiting on word this week, maybe next week, that my parole discharge will be finalized. So I sit here still under the carceral system of justice. But I'm not giving up. You know? And it takes community leaders. It takes people in places of power, movers and shakers. Honestly, like the district attorney's office of George Gascon, who is reshaping policies and making sure that people have a fair opportunity and fair chance when they're subjected to criminal charges. Well, that should have been happening all along, particularly with youth. And they're making strides, and the end rides are there, but there's still such a long ways to go. We need more justice impact professors teaching about youth restorative justice. And we need more talks on community transformative justices for our youth. So we need to empower youth, because the youth are our future. Without the youth, what's left?
So I know there's not a lot of time left, so I'll try to briefly touch on that question. I kind of want to go more into like a micro focus on like individual work that's being done by people in the field that we're all talking about, right? Like all of these policies trickle down into people needing to be able to actually do this work, to go into these spaces and work with youth and provide those resources. So what I'm thinking of right now, Dr. Turner brought up the Black Student Achievement Plan. I have been working in a school district for the last year, and I got the opportunity to kind of see this plan unfold. And one thing that I want to touch on about these policies and implementing these policies is a lot of the time they are just doors that allow people to do more. A lot of the time they just give the permission to actually go in and do more extra work. So when you hear Black Student Achievement Plan, that includes, anything that can help students, Black students, have better health outcomes, have better academic outcomes. And that's obviously very broad, right? So you can do so much with that. One part that I have really liked is specifically with regard to the health impacts of that plan. So when you grow up in an area especially affected by community violence, for example, there's a trauma that comes along with that. And what we are seeing right now in research is that trauma, vicarious trauma, witness trauma, has effects on the human body, on the developing body, especially of children. And what happens when you're in a constant state of like stress response, it kind of eats away at you internally. It gets underneath your skin, is what they say. And it predisposes these kids to lower cognitive outcomes. They're more likely to be absent from school. They're more likely to be identified as having quote unquote behavioral issues, right? When really there's a lot going on in their life and there's stuff going on physically in their body. And so that plan that we talked about, one of the ways that it was able to be creatively utilized was to target toxic stress in youth, which is that stress response I'm talking about, to kind of watch out for the warning signs of when youth are presenting with symptoms of this distress. And I think that's really huge because historically what has happened is, again, this primarily impacts youth of color. And when youth of color are presenting with these symptoms of, higher distractibility, higher irritability in the classroom, teachers don't see that as, oh, this kid needs help. They see that as, oh, I need to punish this youth. They're just not a good student. They aren't doing what needs to be done. When really it could be a sign of all these greater things that we're talking about that actually come down to impact youth on like the cellular basis. So with that model of, trying to identify the signs of something like toxic stress, I feel like we can maybe hope to lower like discrimination within the classroom, because maybe we can start to change our mindset. And that goes back to what everyone is talking about here, is we need to change our mindset of, why is this person acting in this way? What is their story? Where are they coming from? What has led to where they are now? And specifically in youth, their story is unfolding right before us. And that is such a critical juncture at which we can actually come in and hopefully, help them on a different path. And I think a big part of that is community, like we talked about. So much research shows that what helps youth is social support. That's family support. That's community support. We aren't putting money into that, like we talked about. And what has also been shown is schools are so disconnected from that. Schools especially are so disconnected from community and youth families. We need to build social networks that are united. So when I talk about community, I'm talking about various different communities. I'm talking about that youth, neighborhood. I'm talking about that youth city, but I'm also talking about, where they go to school. What is their hospital that they go to when they, aren't feeling well? We need to bridge those gaps, because right now a lot of these sources of support are disjointed. And there's just a lot of work that needs to be done. But there are some wins there. And I just wanted to show where, all these policy things, they have impacts. And we can use them to actually open the door to try to address problems in a creative way for youth.
Thank you very much to our wonderful panelists. We have a quick moment for a Q&A. If anybody would like to raise any questions.
Convincing them, persuading them, motivating them to either look at youth justice or the criminal justice system in terms of, oh, from my experience of like, oh, he deserved that, or that's what he gets, or and niño malo, like something like that. Because it seems like that's where my community's at. Where I'm seeing is that, especially in now predominant California, it's Latinos. 90, I think 80% of our population is like the population is 8% brown. But again, many don't see that as a brown issue. It's more so it's like, oh, you deserve the spanking or something like that. But I feel like it's either it's very hard to kind of convince, my community. And what's your perceptions on, this community that's evolving, multi-generational, first generation? That's I'm just any thoughts on those?
I mean, you shouldn't have to feel like you have to convince. And just being able to listen, right? Listen, because there is even generational gaps, right? Even in the Latinx, Latino community, right? See it a certain way versus the recent, right? It's interesting because even the way I approach certain areas, I have to check myself and regulate myself. Even working with youth, like my experience was my experience. And if I start to define the mechanism based on what I experienced, then I'm neglecting their voice. I have to really see how they're interpreting the issue, how they're seeing their community, so we could have some starting point, right? And I think, if we take the time, and again, at the School of Social Work, it's called client centered, starting where they're at, really, really regulating our own biases that we carry and being able to better understand and just ask the why. Like, why do you see it this way? What's coming up for you? How are they seeing it? And find those common denominators where you could see the connection. And when you see that connection, build from there, right? Because it's daunting, it's challenging, and there's different viewpoints. But in a lot of my community work, honestly, we were talking about this earlier, even, teaching at SC, we need to make those pathways where we're elevating the voices most impacted, because oftentimes they have the solution, right? So just starting where they're at, being present, asking, probing further why they're seeing it the way they are, not coming in with what you want them to see, and just find those commonalities, man, and start to build the connection. And man, some powerful things could come out of it if we're willing to take the time. But it's labor intensive, right? Um, that's what I have to share with you. Hopefully something, right?
I really want to touch on that point of like dialogue. I'm from San Diego, actually, and I grew up in a very low income neighborhood. I went to a predominantly Latina school, and a lot of people I think that I grew up around, when I talk about these things, they express sentiments to like what you described, and I think it just takes a lot of patience, right, on your end to really sit there, and like Dr. Hernandez talked about, have a conversation. and it can be very frustrating. But really, those probing questions, like, oh, where does that come from? I know, especially too, sometimes for me, I found where people make jokes, right, about things that aren't really jokes. A really good question I found is like, oh, well, what makes that joke funny? Like, what is behind that? And that, I think, kind of gets people thinking. Even asking people, because a lot of your time, like, the older generations, they've been through so much trauma themselves. You were speaking to what I heard, intergenerational trauma, right? Like, what did you need when you were young? Can you be that person for youth today? How can we show up for youth in that way now? But yeah, really dialogue.
I just want to say thank you for sharing, James, your story. I too have a similar story where I have lived experience within the former Department of Criminal Justice or California Youth Authority. I now work for a state office that's helping me see that transition from the state criminal justice down to the local level. And thankfully, our office, like my colleague Miguel, they gave us the opportunity to express what solutions could be implemented based on our experiences and as we continue to work in this work. So thank you for sharing. Well, something that I often get asked about is specifically from abolitionists and wanting to deinstitutionalize the facilities, whereas folks like you and I, been in those facilities, have met some of these people that may not be ready to come out so soon. In your perspective or in the panel's perspective, how do we begin to address that for those individuals that may not be ready to transition out with the rest of the people that we're working for to get them out as soon as they can?
That's a good question. And, I just want to say thank you to UCLA and the students here and everybody's here, for this opportunity to allow me to share and to just really give you a piece of information and allow you to look at life from a different perspective when it comes to youth and youth transformation. In answering your question, look, we can't save everybody, right? I was part of that problem, right? I was a lieutenant enforcer with the Aryan Brotherhood prison gang, and it doesn't get any worse than that on the inside. I was the one that would actually direct people and give orders to have people hit, to have people attacked. And you're not going to change that mindset unless that mindset wants to be changed. I went to parole 6 times before I was found suitable for parole. And the overarching thing and circumstance that the parole board wanted to know was, how have you changed? Well, one, I had to learn how to forgive myself. And there's a lot of men and women inside, locked up inside, that aren't ready. They're not ready to forgive themselves. They're not ready to forgive themselves for the trauma that occurred to them beyond their control. And so they keep perpetuating that cycle of violence that was perpetuated onto them from their families. And until that changes, the carceral system is still going to be a hotbed of trauma. But then there's the other factor too, the correctional officer. I remember being cell extracted out of my cell. I lived in an 8x9 cell for 7 years. I was in the chute. And I didn't know when it was light. I didn't know when it was, nighttime. And you get into a routine. And that routine is when the officers come in, you start boarding up. When you board up, you spaghetti your cell, which means you start making fish lines going all the way across your cell, so it makes it harder for them to come in and extract you out. You strip down, you're naked when you're fighting with them. Because when they show that, or when they spray the MK9 pepper spray, it goes all over the place, and you don't want it sticking on your clothes. It's easier to wash off when they spray you down. So the mindset of the men and women who are still involved in the gang mentality when they're inside is also cultural. It's familial. And until that process changed by having that conversation, I've known many people, many men, many hardcore men who have dropped out, went against their family and their culture to give themselves a better chance. But it's because they started believing in themselves, because somebody inspired them. Somebody offered them a way out to allow them to see that they matter as a human being. You know, and the crazy thing is, real quick, each and every one of you living the lives that you live right now, it could change just like that. Just like that. You can be pulled over for a misidentification. Just like that. You can be put in jail over a misidentification or a misunderstanding. How do you think that you would respond to those situations? It's one thing to read about it in a book. It's one thing to see it on TV. But what would you actually do if somebody came up to you and said, I'm taking that, that's mine, while you're inside? That's not fiction. That's real life. So we work hard to try to stop those behaviors from ever happening by starting with the youth. Change the mindset, instill the hope, promote the dreams. Does that answer your question?
Great.
I just want to say we got to make sure that we always have youth voices represented, right? Because I think those who are closely wedded have the solutions. I would also say that we got to recognize the privilege we share. Do I hope and dream that one day we don't have use for prisons or law enforcement? Of course. Are we there? No, right? And recognizing that and owning that, right? It's right now. I mean, in LA County, we went from 19 camps to 3. We only have 2 operating juvenile facilities. Our youngsters are in the community, and the community dynamic is real. And I think sometimes we could theorize, we could say boom, 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 but there's a disconnect when it's actually applied practice. That's why I'm more practice driven, where we need to actually see what's happening in the terrain and the realities and the challenges before we actually start to say, hey, let's go ahead and we got to make sure there's full investment in the community, and that they have the support that they need. So their psychosocial are very tended to, their wellness is tended to, and the bandwidth of the agencies have full capacity to appropriately respond to the needs and challenges of our youth and families. So I just want to put that up. Thank you.
Yeah, really quickly, yeah, just talk to these youth. You know, I work with these youth all the time, and they're so willing to share their story and their perspective. Like, they really are. And a lot of the time, these youth are just coming from places where they don't have any other choices. They don't have any other alternatives. And they're just trying to do their best. And you put that on top of, you know, teachers that aren't, you know, giving them very much slack. And then other life responsibilities, you know, some navigating housing insecurity, some navigating, you know, the foster system. A lot of the time, none of these kids at any point were asked to share their story, right? Um, that's a big step there, just being an ear. You know, letting them get some of their story out is a big part, because I think part of that helps them process. What you talked about, James, right? Not being ready. You know, how can you be ready if no one's even asked you what you've been going through? So I just think that's a big thing there, you know, just offering your ear to hear the stories of people that are really impacted by the carceral state, by the carceral system, and youth specifically, because youth, you know, across so many different spheres are just not listened to at all. So I think it starts by listening to them and inviting them to share.
Thank you so much, Sam. Another round of applause for our panelists. That was fantastic. Unfortunately, we are going to have to cut it. We did run a little bit over time today, but thank you guys so much for being here, for participating, and thank you to our panelists for coming out. This was a great session, everybody.
James DeBacco. Heather Mary.